The Word came into the world, and the world did not know him and did not accept him. I want to talk a little bit today about fighting to be heard. How many people here know a little something about fighting to be heard? Maybe? Yeah, I see some folk. What I learned about it was the year that I was working in El Salvador. It was right after college, and my bishop sent me to work with a priest in El Salvador for a year. And my Spanish was terrible, and being as I was 18 years old, I had a very elevated sense of my own fluency. I was a little arrogant and proud, which is to say I basically had no business being there at all. But I was working with this priest, and he mostly had me doing, administrative stuff, running errands, taking down notes, filing paperwork for him, sending mailings, that kind of stuff. I was his errand boy. And I remember this one Sunday, the church was trying to set up a health program, a little clinic, and they had taken us out to this one little town that was connected with one of his churches. He had 4 churches that he served. And we went out there, it was on Sunday, we had gone out after services, we went out there, and his job was to get people encouraged to kind of sign up for the clinic, to get themselves registered. And my job was just to ask 4 questions, what their name was, what their address was, what their telephone number was, and how many people were in their family. Just those 4 questions, and then just write it down on a piece of paper as they came to me. And I was struggling hard, sweating just to get through these 4 questions. Really hard work for me, just these simple 4 questions. It was a long afternoon. And then we got back in the car, and he drove me back to this church where I was staying before he headed on to the city. And then he said something to me, and my Spanish wasn't that great, so I was sure I didn't hear him right, because I thought he had told me that I would be preaching the next Sunday, right? And first of all, my Spanish was terrible, and second of all, I had never even preached in English at that point, right? So I knew that I hadn't heard it right, so I made him repeat it, and he said it again. It was about 3 times before I felt confident that I had understood that he did want me to preach that coming Sunday. And then I said, that's a terrible idea. I did my best to explain to him that this was a terrible idea because my Spanish was terrible, as we had seen that afternoon. There were several times where I had to call him over just to get down someone's name. I hadn't even heard it right. And also, I told him I had never preached before. And he said, yeah, you can't speak Spanish, and you've never preached before, and that's exactly why you should preach this Sunday, right? And I argued the point with him, but eventually he just put his foot down, and he said, Peter, this is going to happen, right? He said, he wrote on a piece of paper the scriptures for the Sunday. And he said, look them over, decide what you're going to say. And he said, and call me on Thursday, he said, because you are going to preach, but I want to be sure you don't say anything too crazy, right? So I did my best, and I jotted it out, and I figured, I knew that my Spanish was terrible, so I wrote the whole thing out. I researched it, wrote the whole thing out in English, and then I translated it word by word into Spanish, which is not what you're supposed to do, but it is what I did. And then I worked really hard to memorize it, and I called him up, and I talked him through it, and he said, yeah, that'll be fine. And then the Sunday of, he got up. And again, I was just struggling to understand what he was saying. But I picked up enough to hear him say to the congregation, Peter's Spanish isn't good, you know that. He's preaching for the first time. He said, so we're going to receive him with grace and mercy, and we're going to do our best to support him. And I was grateful, And then I got up there, and I started trying to offer some kind of word. And to this day, I don't really remember what it was that I preached, because my mind went blank. I had memorized the whole thing, word for word, and my mind went blank, and I was struggling, fighting to be heard, to be understood. And somewhere in the midst of it, I just hit on one phrase, Dios te quiere, which means God loves you. It was the only thing I could remember, and I just kept repeating it, and people were nodding at a certain point, then I saw people checking their watches, and I'd been going, and decided it was time to sit down, and I was just, and I had that sense, right, that I had been fighting to be heard. Now, how many of you have taken, French or Spanish in high school or something like that, right, and you had to have conversations, right? And you know what it feels like, right, to fight. Even if it's in a conversation, a friendly conversation, you are fighting to be heard. And if you have a friendly conversation partner, you have the blessing that they're fighting with you, right? They'll fill in words, they'll try and help you along the way. But it is really a struggle. We all know what that experience of fighting is like. And it doesn't even have to be in another language, right? Whether it's because someone doesn't understand what the idea you're trying to convey, because they don't think you're worth listening to, because they just want to ignore you, or they don't have the time, or whatever it may be. We have all had the experience of being in conversation with someone and feeling, knowing that we were fighting, we were struggling to be heard and understood. And we know a lot about that in recent years, right? We've had these movements that come along, the movement for Black Lives, the immigrants' rights movement, the Me Too movement, and yes, even the church right now, right, as we are struggling to be heard in a world that does not seem to understand us. These are all movements that are about fighting to be heard when the world does not want to hear, right? We know what it is to fight and struggle to be heard. So why am I bringing this up right now, right? Well, John's gospel, which we heard today, we heard the beginning of John's gospel, and you always know immediately, right, when we're reading from John's gospel, because he's got a very particular way of talking, right? And it's confused. I see some of you shaking your heads, right? John's gospel is hard to listen to. It's hard to read, right? Because he does this weird thing where he repeats himself over and over, and then he'll say something one direction, and he'll say it backwards, right? I am in the Father is in me, right? All things came to being through him. Not one thing that came to being without him, right? He repeats himself, and you get this sense, it's just like, John, why are you being so repetitive? Why are you saying things in such a weird way? And certainly, part of it is because John, more than any of the other Gospels, is trying to open for us the mysteries of who God is and who Jesus is. And you know, when we get to talking about those big mysteries of who God is, we have a hard time making sense, right? Because we're talking things that are bigger than our understanding. But part of it is the very simple fact, all scholars agree about this, John was not writing in his native language. John was not a native Greek speaker. And in fact, his Greek is not particularly good, right? So he's having that very experience that you had in high school French or high school Spanish, where he is fighting, struggling to be heard, to be understood. He is fighting for the audience to hear him. And he repeats himself the way you do, you know, when you feel like you're not being heard or understood. He repeats himself to try and get this message across. Now, one thing you know about fighting to be understood, right, is that if you're fighting to be heard, if you're fighting to be understood about something that doesn't matter, right, you will give up. You will be like, this is just too much trouble. Let's move on and do something else, right? But if it matters, you'll keep coming back to it, even if you don't understand why. Married couples know about this, right? Because you ever had an argument with your spouse, like about the way you hang the dish towels in the kitchen, right? And if that's what it's really about. If you're really just arguing about the dish towels in the kitchen, you can fix that problem, right? You just say, okay, here's our compromise. But most of the time, it's not about that at all, right? It's about something else that matters, because the dish towels don't matter. You can fix that. But if it's about something else, it doesn't matter what you do with those dish towels. You will continue fighting about it until you figure out what it is that matters. What are you really talking about? When you're fighting to be understood, if it matters, you will keep fighting. Now, you may at some point throw your hands up and say, I'm done with this. I'm not doing it again. I'm too tired. Let someone else do the work. But if it really matters, in a week or so, you'll sigh and stand up again and say, okay, let me try it one more time. If it really matters, you will continue to fight to be heard. And John fights his way through all of these long chapters. It's not a short book, right? Because he feels that what he has to share really matters. And he wants his audience to hear it, and he knows that by speaking to them in Greek, which is not his native language, more people will hear it and understand it. He's struggling to get words they will understand, and he ends up borrowing them from someone else. There's a Jewish philosopher, lives around the same time as St. Paul, named Philo of Alexandria. You should probably know his name. It's okay. You can write it down if you'd like. And just like Paul, just like John, Philo is trying to explain his faith in the God of Israel to Greek-speaking people. Because Greek-speaking people were all about, reason and philosophy, and to them, they read the Jewish scriptures and they said, this is, a bunch of nonsense and mythology. This doesn't matter. This isn't important. We want philosophy and truth and things like that. And Philo tried to explain it to them in language they would understand. Now, his Greek was better than John's, but just like John, he was struggling to share something he thought was important, a truth about the God of Israel. And so he used this idea that was important to the Greek people, this idea of logos. How many of you have heard that word? Logos? right? Now, we translate it in today's gospel as the word. That's the way it usually shows up in Scripture, the word, logos. But I'm going to tell you right now, the word is a terrible translation for the word logos. Logos does not mean word. In Greek, there's another word, lexi, that means word. Logos is something different, but it's really hard for us to translate. There's not a word in English that means the same thing. Basically, what it is this, though. Logos is like the logic behind your argument. It's the thing you want someone to understand when you're talking to them. It's the idea that the power of your words, that if someone could just grasp them, right, that they would understand and they would be moved and persuaded by what you have to say. The way it shows up for you is this. When you're having an argument with someone, and you have this feeling that, man, and it feels like you're not getting anywhere, and you have this feeling, if you could just see things from my perspective, if I could just get you to really hear what it is that I mean to say, you would understand, and you would believe, and you would agree with me. You had that feeling? Right? Okay. That's the logos. That feeling behind it, if you just heard what it is that I'm trying to teach you, what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to convey, if you could just see things from my perspective, then you would know that feeling is the logos. It's the logos trying to be born from you, right? You see it in action when, have you ever had the other side of the experience? When someone says something to you or says it in just the right way, and suddenly you feel like a window has been opened and you've seen something new, and you're like, the way you look at the world changes a little bit. Have you ever seen someone giving a speech where you can feel that they have somehow moved the crowd and persuaded the crowd? You ever seen that? That's the logos in action. That's when the logos has been given birth, it's out there in the world, and it has persuaded. So the logos is like the power of an idea to change someone's mind. That's what the logos is about. And Philo says this is exactly what happens in the book of Genesis. He says all the way through, God speaks creation into being, right? Remember this, you know, from the beginning of the book of Genesis. First thing God says in Scripture, right? Let there be light, and there is light. And Philo says that's the logos in action. What God is doing is God is persuading creation. God is saying, I have an idea so big and powerful and beautiful that when I speak it into the world, the light will shine. And Philo hits hard on the idea that God doesn't really command. God doesn't say, turn on the lights. God says this kind of invitation. He says, let there be light. And it's as if creation hears it and is persuaded and lets the light shine. So he says that's what the logos is all about. He says this is God's power of an idea so powerful and persuasive that if you can just get your head around it, you will believe and you will understand and things will happen. So that's Philo's idea, and John borrows it. He borrows this idea of the logos, but John understands a little kind of truth underlying it that Philo doesn't get his head around. Philo gives this idea that like the logos is unopposed somehow, that like God just speaks and everyone kind of nods their heads and say, yes, that's true, I understand, that's right, absolutely, I agree. It's like the way Philo looks at it. Have you ever had an argument with someone and then you play it again in your head, you talk through it again in your head, and you say, oh man, if I had just said this one thing, right, this one phrase, and you imagine in your head that when you say that one thing, they're like, oh my goodness, I hadn't thought about that. You're right. I'm sorry, right? Does that sound familiar? All right? Does it ever work that way? Never, right? Never. Philo thinks that it does work that way. He says God's just going to speak this truth so beautifully and so clearly that everyone who hears it will just nod and say yes. And John says, nonsense. It never works that way. And so John talks about the logos, this idea, this power of God's words, struggling to hear and to be heard and be understood. And he hits it right from the beginning, right? He says that what was brought into the being in the world through the word, through the logos, was light. And the light shined in the darkness, and the darkness could not overcome it. And so right from the beginning, he says this beautiful idea that God has is fighting from the beginning to be heard, and it's as if some part of creation is sort of fighting back. And he talks about the word coming into the world, and what he tells us about that is the world did not know it, and the world did not receive it, and the world rejected it and hung it on a cross to kill it. And he says, so from the beginning, this beautiful idea God has, the power of God's idea, the power of God's words, faces opposition. God's truth is struggling to be heard, right? So the question we should ask ourselves, right? And it's compelling, right? It's like a story. It's got like cinema and drama, right? And the question we should ask ourselves, okay, if there's this idea that's so important to God, right? Because remember we said, things that matter to you are the things that you will still fight to have heard, right? You'll fight to be heard if it really matters to you. And so whatever this idea is seems to matter a lot to God. And we should ask ourselves, well, what is this idea? And John lays it out for us, right? But he's got this funny way of talking, so you got to piece through it a little bit. But he says all the things that have come into being came into being through the Word. And what has come into being through the Word was the life. And the life was the light of all people. And he tells us the Word gives us power to become children of God. So he has these three things. He says the Word gives life to the world. The Word gives light to the world. The Word gives us power to become children of God. And this applies to all creation. He says all things that have been made shine with this light, and they have this life, and they can become children of God. So what he's teaching us is something about who we are, and this is what God wants us to understand, right? This image of God that's inside us, right? That we have God's life in us, and the light of God shines inside of us, and we are children of God, right? And he wants us to hear this and know this, and he says this matters so much to God that God has been struggling and fighting for us to hear this truth from the beginning of creation. And we say these words easily, right, about light and life and being children of God. But I think when we look out at the world, we understand just how revolutionary they are, right? Because we live in a world where it seems life is not valued very highly. Life is cheap, right? And light is hard to come by, right? Truth is apparently up for negotiation these days, right? That light that brings knowledge and truth. And raising this question of identifying us all and knowing, in fact, that everyone you meet is a child of God is a revolutionary statement. We can't ignore that we are now in Christmas season. And this last week, we celebrated the Feast of the Holy Innocents. We remember the part of the Christmas story where Herod determines to have every child in Bethlehem killed under 2 years of age because he's trying to get to Jesus. And we see this naked show of power that would kill children to preserve itself. And on the very day that we remembered that feast, a child died in the custody of our government, right? And so we have this sense that proclaiming that all children are children of God suddenly becomes a kind of revolutionary statement. And so these things that God desperately wants the world to hear and to know, that the light of God shines in us all, that all life comes from God, that we are all children of God in God's eyes, suddenly becomes vitally important. But you understand why God is struggling to have it heard, because it seems like we're stopping up our ears and don't want to know. What John proposes to us, what he closes in saying, and this is the good news of it. He just says God is so determined to be heard. God is fighting so hard to be heard and to be known that in the end God says, if nothing else will let them hear my word, then I will come and live among them. And you have the sense that God goes to where we are and makes God's self vulnerable like one of us, ready to die for our sake, just so we can hear this message and this truth. And again, this is a strategy that many of us do know from our lives, right? Because, you know when you've offended a friend and you apologize to them and they won't hear it and you apologize again? Eventually, what you're going to do is go to their house, right? Because you know then sense by going on their turf, right, in a place where they have say-so, in a place that is their own, rather than asking them to come to you, that there's something powerful in that gesture, that in making yourself vulnerable and being willing to say, hey, look, I really did mess up. And here's what's at stake for me, that I really care about our friendship or whatever it may be, is powerful and persuasive. And that's what God does for us. God says, if nothing else will make you hear, I will walk with you in your life. I will go where you are, and I will make myself vulnerable so that you will hear and know this truth, that God's light shines, that all life comes from God, and that you are children of God made in God's image. And that should be a great encouragement for us, because God is basically saying, look, I will fight and fight and fight until you hear this truth. I will fight to be heard until you and the whole world hears and knows that you are children of God. And that should be a great encouragement for us, partly because as Christians right now, trying to proclaim this same message, just like John is fighting to be heard in a language that is not his own, just like God is fighting from the beginning of creation to have all creation hear this great and wonderful truth, we often feel as Christians that we are fighting to be heard, right? How many of you have tried to share the good news and feel like it landed on deaf ears, right?